This is necking. They kiss for like 1,000, 2 1,000, and then they start rubbing their cheeks and their chins together and like, their necks, and then they go back to kissing. It's like 1,000, 2 1,000, and then he just smears his face across the side of hers and she buries her forehead in his shoulder, and then back to kissing 1,000, 2 1,000. It is a complete mess, but I guess back then it was like salacious and hot.
It was such an odd scene. And how they walk back from the balcony back into their room. The whole thing was so awkward and stilted. And I hadn't read about that 3-second rule. And I'm watching this and I'm like, this is so odd. It's so odd.
Welcome to Don't Encourage Us, the show where we talk about the big ideas behind fiction projects of all different kinds. Books, movies, TV shows, video games, nothing but. I'm your host, Rusty Shackelford, and I'm here with my co-host, President Camacho. How you doing today, Mr. President?
Good as ever.
Today we're discussing the Alfred Hitchcock classic spy romance, Notorious. But first, what's been on your list this week?
I started watching Archive 81. Have you heard about that?
No. Tell me more.
It's a series on Netflix that was actually based on a podcast. And
that does sound familiar.
You can find it on Spotify. They did a great job with this one. It's about a guy, like a young guy, that gets approached by this mysterious person who owns a company, and he wants this young guy to isolate himself in this facility where this archival footage lives. And it's the archival footage of a woman who was doing a documentary in 1994 about a building called the Visser. And there was a fire in that building, and a lot of those tapes were really mangled and burned up in the fire. So he's hired in order to figure out what's going on, what's on those tapes. And then this mystery ensues around it. I don't want to give too much away, but it's really, really well done. The acting's great, that sense of dread, and the cliffhangers at the end of every episode are really intriguing. It's kind of like a slow burn. I'd say it's similar to something like The Twilight Zone, where you're not really ever sure what's going on exactly. And the reveals are really, really significant. Some really nice twists. It never gets boring. It's a really good series. Highly, highly recommend watching it. I have no idea how it's going to turn out. And usually in these types of series, you kind of feel like they're kind of telegraphing the ending. But in this, I have no clue, which is a great thing. And like I said, the acting is phenomenal. So there's two timelines, one in 1994 and one in present day. So you don't know who the guy is who hired this guy, and he says, I'll pay you $100,000 to do this. He's done like a full background check on the young guy, but the young guy doesn't have any knowledge of what the older guy does. His company is completely secretive.
Oh, wow. And they're not the same guy.
They're not the same guy, no. Definitely not.
Okay. He's not paying his past self.
No. I mean, I've been going back and forth with, what's going on exactly, and I haven't been able to figure it out. But it's got some really, really interesting moments of kind of, not your typical jump scare, but a lot more subtle than that. I'm trying to think if there's another movie that you could really compare it to. It's actually produced by James Wan, who did The Conjuring, Saw,
Aquaman.
And Aquaman. I think he did Annabelle too, as part of that Conjuring universe, because there's a character in this called Annabelle.
Oh.
But I think you'd really like it. I highly recommend it.
Archive 81.
Yep.
So how much money does Netflix pay you to do these promotions? And when do I get my cut?
We'll talk about that offline.
Speaking of money, this is a really busy time of year for online retailers. So I was wondering, how are things with the candle business? Is this a busy time of year for you?
It's always a busy time of year. Going through and really trying to promote it. With every online retailer, there's always the issue of how do you do your branding and your marketing when you have not enough resources to really handle, let's say, paid advertising versus organic, like creating content versus getting professional pictures done of your your products. But this year we've really been concentrating on in-person sales. So a lot of pop-ups to try to get that feedback from customers, because we're really in early stages with the business, but it's been pretty exciting.
That's great. Yeah, from what I can tell from social media, because I follow your Listoic Instagram and socials, you're also on TikTok too, I think. So you've been doing pop-ups in New York all around, right? Like West Elm, is that correct?
West Elm.
Yeah. How's that been? Like meeting customers, like hanging out in the West Elm? It's
been really fun. Getting to meet a lot of different people, getting to meet the staff. They've all been really nice, and it's great because you get a lot of customers from all over the world, especially in the Brooklyn location, because there's so many tourists there. So you get a lot of different types of feedback from different people, and you get to kind of see like what do they really like and what do they not like, which is great. So you can really modify the product as needed, depending on what the feedback's like. Because always, like with everything, you have an idea of what people will like, but what people actually like is often very different than your own taste. So that's been really interesting. Yeah,
I've noticed that with the show, right? We don't have a live studio audience anymore. We canned that feature. So we don't get the immediate feedback, right? Like we can look at some of the metrics online, but it's really hard to tell what people responded to. Like, do they like this segment? Do they like that segment? Which of us do they think is the better host? It's hard to tell.
There's always that controversy.
We think we know, but right. It's always up for debate. So any interesting trends that you've seen in actually interacting with your customer base, your fans? Like anything stood out to you that's shaped your business?
Yeah, I think one of the big things is that you really have to go with the person's first reaction for what they like and not convince them that you have other products to sell, because you often will ruin the sale. So if they say,
you sour the sale,
I like this, and then if you're like, oh, but what about this and this other one and this other thing and this, they get overwhelmed. So they get analysis paralysis. When if you just stay quiet and wait, you're way more likely for them to buy something or multiple things from you. But I've seen it happen, especially in the beginning of doing this, since, it's a learned skill like anything else, this whole like in-person selling. Since I don't have a retail background, for me, everything's online. It's very, very different. And you can't really apply the same techniques you're using online, because when you're advertising online, it's so targeted. But this, you're getting such a swath of people. And you'll notice things like before lunch, you don't do very well in terms of sales. People are hungry and are looking forward to lunch. And then after, that's when things start really picking up. They start lingering around the store longer. They start picking things up. They're a lot more casual and in a lot more positive of mood. And I think there's studies that kind of back that in terms of people's decision-making before and after they eat. I heard something about a study that they did with actually convictions in court. You're way more likely to get convicted or have a negative result from a judge if he hasn't eaten. After he's gone, you always want to, be in the courtroom after lunch, not before it.
So you want to drag it out.
Yeah, you got to watch it. Talk very, very slowly. You have like a 10-minute point to make, just make it a half an hour. Get to noon, 12:30. Exactly. Oh, got a break for lunch. You might get a life sentence, or you might get let go over a Big Mac.
That's right. Release on bail, just all because of the supersized fries. Yeah. All right, you heard it here first. Useful life tips.
This could save your life someday. No, but yeah, I think it's been very interesting, and it's great to, like I said, to get that in-person feedback is really invaluable, because you'll hear things that you would never hear online, like, changes to the product, or maybe there's a product that you think is going to be a bestseller, but it just really doesn't resonate.
So you guys have broadened your offerings. You made a big move from just candles to candles and scent sprays?
Room sprays and also reed diffusers. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to just make it a home fragrance brand instead of just having candles, and that's been great. People really love diffusers, and they really love room sprays. And that's another big lesson. We've noticed that there'll be people who will say, oh, I never like burning candles. That's not my thing. But a room spray, that would be great for me. Or a diffuser that I could just set up somewhere and not worry about. That's great. So you need to have those options. When at first we were just going to focus on the candle piece, but you realize you're losing a lot of sales if you just do that.
Right. Well, it also distinguishes your brand a little bit too. When you're in person and you're dealing with customers and you've got your products in front of you, is there a difference between selling the candles and the diffuser and the sprays and the other things? Like, do people gravitate towards one or the other? Is it easier to kind of demonstrate one or the other? Or is it like people come up and they seem to have one type of product in mind and you're just picking from that?
That's a good question.
Like
if they, let's say, grab a candle and they're like, oh, I love this candle, it's often a really good idea to use the spray as a sample of the scent. So then you get them thinking in two different ways. So you get them thinking about the candle. Oh, that's nice. But the scent is a lot stronger and it's a lot more visual, like a demonstration. And they really gravitate towards that.
Yeah.
And then they have like a tester that they can walk around the store with. And oftentimes they'll come back because they've been smelling it the entire time. So they have that constant reminder.
Interesting.
So that's been interesting.
What a great idea to let them take it with them a little bit and like exist with the scent.
Yeah. The other thing is if they handle the product. So there'll be some people that'll walk up and just lean over and smell it. They don't want to touch it, but you're much more likely to sell if they're actually handling the product.
I wonder what the thinking is there. Like, I don't want to commit. If I touch it, I feel like I've committed somehow. Is that what that is?
Well, actually, they do this in Apple stores. You know, have you ever been to an Apple store and you notice all the sirens in an Apple store, and you notice all the laptops are kind of folded inward, like you can't really see them? I don't know if you've ever noticed this. They do this on purpose, so that when you walk up to it, you have to hold it and push the screen up.
Oh, so interesting. Okay, so that added engagement psychologically invests people in like thinking more
in
about
like
the product,
ownership,
I guess,
of
or
it.
evaluating it differently. Yeah.
It's like the IKEA effect.
Yeah, like I'm using it.
Like when you build the furniture, you have the sense of ownership. This is another kind of offshoot of that they angle those monitors down on the laptops. So you can't really see it. You know it's there, but you have to kind of push it up, and then it gets you engaging with it.
Yeah. So when customers come up and they don't pick up something, you just toss them a candle.
Literally I give it to them.
Best.
Immediately. And you always start with the best seller. Like for us, it's Verdant Growth, it's called, because it's a very fresh scent. It's very gender neutral. And it reminds you of like a spa or a boutique hotel kind of smell. So it's very universal. So if there's a couple there,
that sounds
you'll
nice.
notice that the guy's standing kind of in the background. And what'll always happen is that his wife or girlfriend will smell it, and then she'll pass it over to the boy. Oh, you'd like this. So then you get two people kind of involved in the sale, and he's kind of hooked in. So if you give them more floral scent, typically one or the other is going to like it. So the one that says no is going to influence the other one in terms of the purchase decision. Yeah, so these are all these little things that we're learning over time that we didn't know at first. At first, we were just kind of pushing everything. Smell this, try this, look at this, we have this. And it just doesn't work. It's better to just be more passive, I guess, in the way that you're selling, kind of asking questions more like, you know, what kind of scents do you like? Where will you be using this? Oh, the diffuser's better for the bathroom as opposed to a candle, or a room spray is just like an anytime type of thing that you can use whenever. Like how would you be using it? So if they're more passive, you always lean them towards a diffuser, but if they're more active and they're like, don't mind using a product more, you push them more toward a room spray or a candle, which is much more active. There's a lot to learn.
And you're just beginning.
Just starting.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's just scratching the surface. Wow, great. I can't wait to hear more. So if you're listening to this and you're interested in checking out any of the stuff he's talking about, we'll put some links, the show notes. Any particular place you'd like to direct people if they want to learn more other than just your website?
Our Instagram is pretty active. So it's just at La Stoic. That's where we put up a lot of any new scents that come out or anywhere we're going to be in New York. It's going to be there.
Great. Come meet the celebrity co-host in person.
Come by and say hello if you recognize me.
Yeah. Yeah. They'll have to guess which one of you is the podcast.
It won't be that tough, I think.
All right. So this week we are talking about Notorious, the 1946 Alfred Hitchcock film. Did you get a chance to watch this
No, I didn't
one?
know. Of course I did.
Well, it's free on YouTube. So if you're listening to this episode and you have not seen Notorious, you've had, 80 years or whatever to do it. I don't know what your problem is, but you haven't had time. It is free on YouTube. So you can just Google Notorious 1946 or Alfred Hitchcock and watch this movie. That's what I did.
I
Where
watched
did
it on
you watch
YouTube.
it?
It's also ad-free, which I was very surprised about.
Yes, ad-free. That was shocking. I assumed it was on YouTube. I found it on YouTube and went, yeah, but I don't want to deal with ads. So I looked elsewhere. It was not anywhere else that I could find, not conveniently. And then no ads. Just played it straight through. It was perfect. And it was decent quality. Looked good. I was very happy with that. I'll try to remember to put that link in the show notes as well. So this one stars Cary Grant. I'm a fan. Apparently he was kind of a jerk, but I like him a lot in his roles. Ingrid Bergman and Claude Rains play the major roles in this film. It currently sits at 100% on Metacritic.
That's really interesting. I wonder if it's just... I know it's a classic now, and I know there was some... It got very mixed reviews when it came out. Did you know that?
Yeah, that's interesting. And before we get into that, what do you think the plot was?
The plot is about a woman whose father was a Nazi spy, and he gets convicted. And then she's approached by the Cary Grant character, who's like a federal agent who wants to
CIA?
something. I don't think they ever say no. And he wants her to infiltrate this ring of Nazi spies in Brazil. And it's really about the infiltration of that spy ring, but I would argue that it's more about their romance than the actual infiltration of the spy ring. And it's really how their romance develops and how she gets more and more into this spy ring by way of a guy named Sebastian, who's part of this plot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Claude Rains. Yeah.
And his mother has a very, very big role in what unfolds at the end. But I don't want to give any of that away. What would you say?
We are going to give all that away. So I originally picked this film because I was looking for a spy movie, right? I know you like spy movies. You often indulge my choices in other things. So I thought, all right, I'll Google like what are the top spy movies of all time. And this one came up on multiple lists, right? Like relatively legitimate web pages, as if that's not an oxymoron. And I thought, all right, great. This must be really a lot of intrigue and some really good spy moments. And Alfred Hitchcock's amazing. So I figured there'd be a lot of suspense and tension and things like that. But this, in my opinion, is a romance. Right? The spying piece of it is really just an obstacle for their love. So this is a very melodramatic, romantic film. Overall, what was your opinion? Just broadly, would you recommend this movie? Did you like it?
I liked it. I felt like it wasn't Alfred Hitchcock's strongest film, but I think you really have to look at it through the lens of its time in order to really enjoy it.
Sure.
Because we've seen so many film noirs and spy films since that time, but when you realize like that genre wasn't really a thing when it came out, I think as a film, it's an enjoyable film. I think if you're looking for something with a very complex plot or anything, it doesn't really have any of that. And really to enjoy it, you really have to enjoy the two leads, Because if you're kind of looking at the plot alone,
a lot of weight on their shoulders.
If you're looking at it as a plot-based spy movie, it's very, very simplistic. There's not really that much going on. But yeah, I would recommend seeing it if you want to see, just kind of a freeze frame into that time period and some of the social mores too of how people interacted. And also, did you know that for the kissing scenes, they could only kiss for less than 3 seconds because of censors?
I was going to ask you about that. So so for those of you who don't know, Back then, this was before the current MPAA rating system, right? So the motion picture production code was in effect, and it was just an effort to self-regulate, right? To avoid a government crackdown for decency violations, they created this motion picture production code, also called the Hays Code, I think, and had many rules about what you could and could not show on screen, like what was deemed appropriate or inappropriate. And one of the rules was kissing on screen should not exceed 3 seconds. And Alfred Hitchcock, I guess cleverly is the description, filmed the scene where Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman. Have you ever heard the term necking?
Yeah, I've heard it. Yeah.
This is necking. They kiss for like 1,000, 2, 1,000, and then they start rubbing their cheeks and their chins together, and like, you know, their necks, and then they go back to kissing. It's like 1,000, 2, 1,000, and then he just smears his face across the side of hers, and she buries her forehead in his shoulder, and then back to kissing 1,000, 2, 1,000. It is a complete mess, but I guess back then it was like salacious and hot.
It was such an odd scene. And how they walk back from the balcony back into their room. The whole thing was so awkward and stilted. And I hadn't read about that 3-second rule. And I'm watching this and I'm like, this is so odd. It's so odd. They're having these.
I couldn't even watch it. Like, look away.
It's like cringy, you know?
It's so embarrassing. It's like, welcome to Earth, aliens. You know, try to mimic human behavior. Now we will kiss.
It was so strange. She starts talking about she's got a chicken in the icebox. That was so funny. And it was dialogue like, oh, you cook. Oh, I cook now, but I don't really know how to cook. And then like kiss. And then like, there's a chicken in the icebox. Oh, but you don't cook. Oh, should we eat out? Like in between all of this is like a peck. And they're dragging each other back into the room. I was like, what is this scene? What are they talking about?
It was so funny. It was ridiculous. Of course, now in a movie today, it would be like a 7-minute like
sex scene,
where they'd be pounding each other like all up against the furniture.
It's like that. It would be like that again. That Netflix
rooms.
Movie that they did recently, like 3 of them, which was this like explicit, you know, sex movie that had like no plot and the acting was horrendous. It was like, what was it called? 2 Weeks or something. It's got a number in the title. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
I don't know. I don't get a check every time I say Netflix on the podcast.
Well, you should. I'll show you how to be a Netflix affiliate when you're podcasting. Which isn't a bad idea. No, if you compared that movie that I'm talking about to this movie, I mean, it's so ridiculous how far things have changed.
I guess by Hollywood standards at the time or audience standards at the time, if you went to a movie, like, I mean, I guess people saw this movie and they walked out like, oh, I'm going to have to push the beds together tonight. You know,
Right.
like they were all fired up.
Honey, you could stop sleeping in the other room tonight.
Maybe just wear one robe to bed, huh?
Oh, and the outfits were so over the top in this, which I also love. Like her outfits, like
Oh yeah,
furred
everybody's like,
out,
full suits.
furs.
It's like Christmas Sunday. Like, yeah.
And there's a part where she has like I guess you'd say like a little halter top on or something for the time. Like you could see a little belly button. He covers it with a scarf. Like he just has his scarf.
Yeah. Well, that was part of her character, right? So when we first meet her, she's living in
Miami,
I guess. Mm-hmm. Was that right? Miami, right. So she's living in Miami. She's the daughter of a wealthy industrialist who, I guess he's originally from Germany, and he's been secretly dealing with the Germans, undermining America. The year is 1946. So it's after World War II. We're in the post-World War II Reconstruction period. And I guess Americans or the government is sort of hunting down the spies and the remnants of the Nazi army. So she is self-pitying and self-destructive. Like her father's just been convicted. Nobody really blames her, I guess, but she's, I guess, lost her reputation. Her family has. She still has money, but she's an alcoholic. She's out of control. And I guess they didn't want to say this, but the implication was she's kind of slutty.
Yeah.
Were they trying to kind of?
I think so. I think
Yeah.
that was like kind of like the what he was getting at every time he was kind of talking. Oh, back to that again. Like he would say little comments to her, you know, not just about the drinking, but yeah, I think that's what they were getting at.
Yeah. Yeah, the culture back then around a woman's sexuality like was weird. It was sort of like Alfred Hitchcock was holding her up as an exciting, sexy kind of bad girl a little bit. Like, you know, she's dramatic. She's living her life. Like she's vibrant, you know, but at the same time, because of the culture at the time, he kind of had to present it as like, but those things are sort of bad, at least as far as the majority of the characters are concerned. But they very quickly kind of overlook it. You know, like it was hard to tell with Cary Grant whether he found her wild side appealing or if he was sort of just putting up with it.
Yeah, I think.
Did you get a sense
it felt
of
like
that? What the message
I didn't really
was
understand what the message was because he kept going back and forth. Like, what did he want her to do? Really?
Yeah.
Like she wants him.
Right. It was
She wants him to
unclear.
get in with this spy ring, and he wants to go like deep into it, but she doesn't. I guess he doesn't want her getting involved with this guy, but she has to in order to do that. So it was like exactly what he wanted. And that car scene with her was very odd, with him and her in the car. Yeah,
The drunk driving. Oh my god, that
it was
so
bizarre.
weird.
She's totally drunk. He knows it, and he just lets her drive.
Right.
And then
she's all over the
road.
road, audience. This is early
Yeah.
in the film, right? She's like, I feel like drunk driving, and he's like, okay, let's go. And she is like going up like 100 miles an hour or something, swerving all over the road in the middle of the night, and he's just sitting there. Anyway,
yeah, it
please
was just
continue.
strange. And then she freaks out at him, but instead of like walking away or getting out of the car, he like grabs her arms and starts pushing her down in the seat and like kind of like taking her by force back to her house, you know, like a child. It was just such a strange thing. What does he do at the end? Does he choke her out or something? Because she passes out.
I was going to ask you, did he punch her? Did he punch her? So there's a scene where she gets pulled over and the cop's like, well, you're drunk and obviously you're going to jail. And Cary Grant hands his ID, I guess, that says I'm a CIA agent. And the cop backs off, is like, oh, have a nice night. Good luck or what. I was like, yeah, right. Like any cop would do that. They'd be like, yeah, nevertheless, she's going to jail. But anyway, the cop leaves and she gets feisty. She wants to keep driving. Cary Grant sort of pulls her behind him so that the camera is to his back and we can't see her. And then he like pops his arm and she goes limp and he shoves her over and so, okay, she's so drunk that theoretically she could have passed out. Maybe he just slapped her. It looked to me like he punched her unconscious.
Yeah, because she's suddenly unconscious
that?
from being completely conscious 2 seconds. I think that's the implication, which I found very disturbing.
He knocked
it was
her
really
out.
disturbing. Like, and so bizarre that would happen.
What do you think the audience reaction was at the time? Do you think they were like, oh my God, he just knocked her out? That is insane. Or were they like, well, that's a shame, but it's for her own good? You know, like what
I
do you
think the
they
latter,
thought?
unfortunately.
Wow. Yeah, that's
But
not how I would
think
start a
about
romance.
the censors of the time, right? They're worried about some kissing, but a scene like that is totally fun. There's no controversy over that, right? It's crazy.
No.
It's completely insane.
He just knocked her unconscious. You know,
No
that's
big
what
deal.
you do.
And he's the hero of
Wow.
the movie, right? This isn't a villain
Right?
who's doing this.
No.
Like,
Right.
instead of
Yeah,
saying
I
like,
mean,
okay,
he let
I'll
her
take the
drive
keys.
drunk.
We're walking home. His way of doing things is just to knock her out.
I that blew my mind. I had it took me a little time to recover.
Yeah,
from that.
yeah, me too. I was like, this is really crazy.
So what about the age of the characters? Did you get a sense of how old the characters were supposed
I
to be?
can never tell in these types of movies how old anyone's supposed to be.
It's hard.
because it seems so
Right.
dated. Everyone just seems much, much older. But I know if you were to look them up, you'd be like, oh, Cary Grant was 25 in this movie and she was 18 and Claude Rains was 32, you know, like I can't really tell. And they also cast people like the Claude Rains character and his mother look the same age to me. Like exactly the same age. So I didn't really know what was going on.
Oh, well, there was probably only like 16 years between them,
Right.
You know, in age, like with the characters. Yeah. So Cary Grant turned 42 while filming this movie, and Ingrid Bergman was 30.
Really? Wow.
Yeah,
It's
isn't that
very
interesting? It really changes things. Because I thought her character was supposed to be like 22, right? Like 21, 22. Just a bit out of control. And she's been, I don't know, what's the word? Living life, right? Having fun with men, not yet settled down, that kind of thing. But actually, the actress was 30. I don't know. They never really gave us an indication of the age of the character. So I'm just going to assume that audiences at the time could peg her at around 30, or she was famous enough that they knew that. So you have a leading man who's 42 and a leading woman who's 30, and it puts the entire story in kind of a different context.
It does. Did you feel as if like that's how they wanted to set it up? As if, I put it this way, if they wanted to just make her seem like an immature, naive woman, but at the same time also having this wild side? Do you think that was the dynamic there? Or were they just going for her having a wild side and not really thinking about that age gap?
Yeah, I don't know. So my initial, when I watched it before I knew how old everybody was, I sort of perceived her as a younger, more vulnerable woman who was being thrust rather unfairly into a very dangerous, very difficult situation. And she had feelings for Cary Grant, like maybe initially was drawn to his... he has like a strong sense of authority in this film. Like he seems like somebody who knows what he's doing. And so I felt like she needed guidance, unconsciously was seeking out that kind of guidance, and had, I guess, some daddy issues or whatever, but she had lost her father and wanted stability. She wanted somebody to give her direction, and Cary Grant his character gave her very bad direction. But she was doing her best as a young, somewhat naive woman to present a confident front, and just, but that wasn't supported by actual confidence. So anyway, now that I know her age, especially for the time, it seems more like they chose an adult, like a more sophisticated, developed woman who had chosen a path in life, of not getting married or not having a family or, any of those things, and had sort of settled into being this type of person, right? And so they chose her for that reason, and she played that role. Like she's manipulative and, focused a little too much on risk and fun and danger. And, so she's a better choice than I would originally have thought. She's less vulnerable in this case and more responsible for herself. So that does change the dynamic. In a way, it almost makes them a better fit because they're more equal in this way.
Yeah,
right?
It does.
Does that make sense?
It's hard to tell sometimes because I don't really know in terms of, for that time, the 1940s, were casting choices always done in this way, regardless of what the character's background was supposed to be? Was it always the older leading man and the much younger leading lady? Were they ever supposed to be in more equal footing, or was it always just implied?
Right, like what's an appropriate age gap? Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, easily solvable, but I don't know how that works. Like in Casablanca, was there a huge age gap there between the two leads, or any of the other big movies of that time? Because that would be really interesting to know, like how directors and producers and writers thought of this. Or was it another decision altogether, just marketing wise? This is a marketable actress. This is a marketable leading man, regardless of the script. If we put them both in here, then age isn't the factor.
Like
in the way we're looking at it.
We want Cary Grant, so we need an actress who's 30, at
Exactly.
least 30, right? Otherwise, there's 40 years between
Right.
them or whatever. It's just too much. And then they just, maybe edited the script a little or altered it, or just said, well, Cary Grant's playing a character who's 30 something, 32, 33, and Ingrid Bergman's playing a character who's 22, right? And everybody who watched it was just like,
Right.
that's fine.
Yeah. It's
all make
an interesting
believe.
question, because it could be,
It
there
really
could be
is.
a lot of different factors
Yeah.
for it that we're not even really aware of because of the way that, society looks at film in general. We're just looking at it through our lens, modern filmmaking.
Well, it's interesting to think about. And I've often been really fascinated with the period immediately following World War II. It's really a unique period in human history where there was this unprecedented time of reconstruction and reshuffling power and alliances, right? United States kind of came into being a world power around that time. It's very dynamic, right? People focus on the few years of World War II, but the decade after that is a really interesting period to set a story, especially dramas or even action films. Like, there were a lot of things that happened. It wasn't this like war's over and then everything just went back to normal. That's just not how it works. So I've been wanting to set a project during that period for years. I have several ideas, mostly for movies, that are set in that period, just as a backdrop, right? I'm not trying to make some broad story about Reconstruction, but just that, I think there were a lot of unusual events and circumstances that occurred before the world settled into its new normal. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, there's a character they could use, Union Jack, who was a little bit like Captain America for Great Britain. And he had like the big Union Jack flag on a symbol on his chest. And it's a pretty cool outfit. But I would love to do a story about a British action spy character who was supposedly carrying a little bit on the tradition of Captain America, but set during Reconstruction. Because if you think about it, there were probably a lot of really interesting missions that a government agent from England could go on during the Reconstruction period, right? Like, there were still enemy forces around, there were leftover munitions, weapons, there were companies and organizations trying to take advantage of the chaos, like so many things that were happening, not just in Europe, but in North Africa and all over the world. There were downed planes. There were attempts to reestablish governments and monitor for bad behavior. Like, anyway, I just think it's a really rich period that isn't visited by Hollywood or by creatives that often.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there was so many things after the war that happened that are just not as mainstream, like how Nazis escaped from Germany. I would always wondered that.
Yeah.
But they basically had like their own kind of underground railroad where they were getting falsified papers. And I guess the Vatican was also involved with this. Governments, the Argentinian government was involved, Perón, to get them all into Argentina, give them safe passage.
Sure.
So there's a lot of lot of stories there.
I think so. I think there's a lot of international missions that a government agent could explore and go on and conduct in that time that would just be so interesting, right? Because so much was in the air, so much at the time was unknown, right? It was just a unique period. So it was kind of cool to see this film. For those of you who didn't see it, it starts in Miami, but after Devlin, that's Cary Grant's character, recruits Alicia, that's Ingrid Bergman's character, they go to, was it Brazil?
Rio.
Is that right? Brazil, right. They go to Rio because Cary Grant wants, or I guess Devlin wants Alicia to reconnect with a American businessman with German ties. Is that correct? No. Is he American?
I don't know.
So Claude Rains plays a, sort of titan of industry who I guess has settled down there in Rio. He's gotten involved with some former Nazis, current Nazis. I don't know what their status is
I
after.
guess that they would always be Nazis, right?
Right. Okay. So Nazis. Right. And the secret of the plot is, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you what their plan was. They had found a source of uranium in the mountains of Brazil. And they were sneaking that uranium in the form of like pebbles or dust or whatever. They were sneaking the ore out in wine bottles. Right. So they were going up to this small mountain town. They were bringing it down to Rio. And then I guess they were going to ship it to, I don't know, a lab or something. They didn't really say, but they were going to use it to create atom bombs and blow up America or something like that. So Claude Rains is involved in this. He's not really driving that plot, right? There are other Nazis that have more authority than him, but they're using his wealth and chateau. He has like this big mansion, right? And so they're in his huge wine collection and wine cellar. And they're using that as this sinister, or like part of that sinister plot. And so Devlin wants Alicia to reconnect with Claude Rains. Alexander Sebastian is his name. So Alicia reconnects with Alexander. He's obsessed with her. They've dated before. Then he brings her into his world, separate, of course, from the conspiracy, but into his home, and he's dating her and so on. So that is where the rest of the film takes place. And actually, interesting to me, I don't know if you noticed this, but there weren't very many sets. A lot of the scenes were limited to one location, like they were fairly static. And I don't know if that's typical of the time, but there weren't a lot of like, we're going to go here while we're talking and go here and go here. It was just sort of like they come, they sit down, they talk, and then scene's over, and then
scene. I would think that would be due to microphone technology. So when characters are moving in public spaces, you have to have really good microphones to pick up the sound and not pick up background sound. So it would just be a lot easier to have these staged sets, almost like a play, where you can control everything.
It feels like a play. Yeah, this movie really felt like a play to me. And I think that's probably typical of the time for the reasons you're saying. But it did really remind me how far movie technology has come and filming styles as a result, which we talked about in a previous episode.
And did you happen to read about the most important shot in that film?
Is that the one with the mother? Is that the shot they were talking about? Or no, it was the one with the key.
Yeah, that he used a crane shot from the second floor all the way down to the first floor level and zoomed in on her hand with the key in it. This was a revolutionary thing for the time period. No one had ever done something like that. I guess with Hitchcock, he was so great at like showing you exactly what he wanted to show you and omitting everything else. So having the audience really focus in on these elements that he really was driving towards, like the key in general. You know, we take all that for granted as techniques of cinema now, but then it was revolutionary. Right. You know, the way he would zoom in on the key in her hand, connecting that to the zoomed in key on the table, the realization by the character, oh wow, it's because of that storyboarding that he did and how meticulously he planned all these movies. I think we discussed that in a previous episode.
Yeah, so that is really interesting because when you watch this movie now, it's hard to appreciate some of why it's become a classic.
Exactly.
Right? Because for those of you who haven't seen it, once Alicia is now living with Alexander, the wealthy German businessman, she's accepted a marriage proposal. So she's living with him now in this mansion. She figures out that there's something going on around the wine bottles, and the wine cellar is locked. So much of the film, like key scenes, revolve around her trying to get the key, trying to keep the fact that she has the key from Alexander, and then returning the key and all that kind of stuff. So the scene you're referring to is a big, if you imagine the big entrance or
foyer,
is it the sort of, right. It's a big foyer or whatever they call it. And it's a party. So there are a lot of people, and Ingrid is standing there and she's nervously sort of twirling or in her hand, sort of turning over the key to this cellar. And Alfred Hitchcock did a long shot which starts very high up, you know, kind of almost overhead, but not directly, looking at all the party people and stuff. And then it slowly zooms down all the way to her hand. And that's a very transformative, very unique concept in film. Similarly, there's a great scene where Alexander's mother, who also lives at the mansion, is introduced to Alicia, right? So this is the introduction of the, Uber Mater to our main character, Alicia. And there's a really interesting shot where she almost like the mother like almost floats into screen from long distance, and it's sort of awkward and creepy, and she has a real intense presence. And I didn't feel like that was followed up for a while. Like it was many more minutes into the film until I really got the sense that that mother character was going to be as significant as she was. But her introduction, I felt like, was a very specifically choreographed shot. Did you pick up on that as well?
I didn't pick up on it as much as I picked up on the key shot, because that one, I don't know, to me that was really like very, very planned and focused in on this one thing that was quote unquote the key to the whole mystery. So it really caught my attention.
Clever.
Exactly.
I see what you did there.
Keep listening to the podcast. There's more where that came from.
Yeah, right. That's why they re-listen. You listen 3 or 4
just
times.
Hit
you
that.
Get those little
hit
clever
that.
Comments.
If you got another hour to spare, just listen again. Rewind.
Doesn't really get good until the 3rd re-listen. So I wonder if that's the difference between us, because I've noticed as we do more of these episodes, you do tend to focus more on direction, and I do tend to focus more on story. And so I think the introduction of the mother character was very significant. It was presented as very significant to the story, and I was surprised that it took so long for that to pay off, right? Whereas obviously you were drawn to the most visually famous shot in the entire film, probably for that year, right? It was a big deal. Yeah. So it's not surprising, I guess, you would pick up on that and I'd pick up on the other one. But I'd be curious what other people picked up on. Yeah,
I thought the other shot, I wonder how they did it, was when she was drugged and she's trying to walk away from Sebastian and his mother.
Oh, yeah.
And they kind of like, I guess maybe they inverted the film and added this like shaky effect to it in terms of like them being out of focus. It was just interesting. I'm sure that was a big deal for the time too, because I don't know how you do that. That technique probably had to be invented for that movie.
There were a couple other really interesting visual elements since we're on that topic. Introduction of Cary Grant. At the time, he was a huge star, but when we meet him in this film, he is a dark silhouette with his back to us. So in the beginning of the film, she's relatively early. Alicia is drunk. She's having a party. She's got friends over there drunk. Cary Grant is sitting motionless with his back to us. You would not know it was Cary Grant, right? If you didn't know he was in this. And she's talking to him and he's not really speaking.
Yeah.
Right. Do we hear him?
I don't think
we
so,
do.
no.
Right. And then she gets drunk and like passes out. And when she wakes up in the morning, she's like laying down. Then we see him in the doorway, and isn't it like upside down or something like that?
I think it's upside down. He's like turning or something, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very weird. It's so, I don't know if that was intentional to sort of play off Cary Grant's fame. Like instead of making the usual, here's our big celebrity, right? They were trying to introduce him in a way that would kind of draw you in and feel more creative and interesting. Or maybe it was meant as a way to represent the influence he was going to have on her life, like not necessarily positive and turn things upside down.
Perhaps, yeah.
Yeah. In a way, he was a threat. Yeah. So, I don't know. Any other visual elements stand out to you?
He was really famous for rear projection technique. So when they're driving, like projecting the background on a screen as they're driving. And I guess that was also very revolutionary at the time. Instead of having them out and about driving and then having a camera car in front of the car and them pretending like they're driving. But it was all like in a set. Again, very controlled. Controlling the environment was his other big thing.
Yeah, I found that to be a little distracting, but it wasn't terrible. It was just very obviously fake. It's like when you do a Zoom call with someone and they've got some ridiculous background and you're like, that's
You're not really in space? Wait a minute.
Right? Like, I know your office isn't that clean. Nice try, right? Yeah. So I don't like that kind of thing. But it was okay. It only took me out of the scenes every now and then.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else about this film that was really... One thing I really like about these old films that's so different from new ones is that editing style where things fade to black and a new scene starts, or they're just straight cuts between scenes. And
Right.
you're not using really fancy editing techniques in order to go from place to place. I really appreciate that,
Right.
because it really isn't distracting. It's like, okay, here's a scene. Now we're moving into a new scene. There's not some crazy jump cut or like transition like a Ridley Scott movie or something, or like a Man on Fire with Denzel, where there's like all different colors shooting all over the place and transitions and sound effects. You know, I think it really goes back to a really well-written story and really focusing in on the characters themselves instead of using trickery to kind of move the story along. They didn't really have access to that sort of to those techniques. Who knows if you would have used them, but I always really appreciate, especially with his films, how they go from scene to scene and really move the story along. It wasn't boring, this movie. I didn't find it boring. It was
That's a
well
good
paced,
point,
even though it
right?
was dated compared to what we've seen recently.
Yeah, there's some older films of this period that are like super engrossing, you know, really exciting, fun to watch. And Hitchcock has some great ones in there. But I think this one, it certainly flowed well. Like I didn't like tune out.
No.
You know, we've watched some other movies, like the Indiana Jones movie that we were talking about a little while ago, the most recent one. I thought it was fine, and it moved along pretty well, but there were a couple times where I did have a little trouble maintaining attention, even though obviously they were using explosions and a lot of these other techniques to like keep me engaged. But this film did not have that problem. I was definitely watching. I was invested in the characters. I was curious what was going to happen. It's not that high intensity machine gun stimulation that we're used to. But it did a great job holding my attention, which says a lot for 1946.
Absolutely. And it's black and white, where you typically lose your kind of attention because we're so bombarded now by color, everything, everywhere, you know? So I think it says a lot for it, for sure, that it kept a really nice pace. And it left a lot of questions open from scene to scene to be answered in the next scene.
Yeah.
Which is really good storytelling.
Right. Definitely a quality film. There were some interesting themes in this film, and I don't know that we need to go through it. It's not film class. I did notice, though, that this idea of the controlling mother, you know, like Claude Rains' character had a very, what's the word?
Domineering?
I don't want to say, yeah, he had a domineering mother, right? Like she had too much control of him and had raised him to be weaker than he needed to be. Right, he wasn't as strong and independent as he was capable of, at least not the way Claude Rains played that character. And his mother undermined him, right? And so this kind of domineering mother relationship, in some ways, I think is a prelude to Psycho, right? I think Hitchcock's filmography, if I can say that word, continues to explore this idea of a relationship with mothers, and Psycho is maybe like the pinnacle of that. You know, the most extreme example. But this was like an early lean in that direction thematically. What do you think?
Yeah, I think in his films, they just kind of build on each other over time. I think the later films, say like a Vertigo, you can see all of the techniques of the preceding films kind of put in place into that, which I think it makes him even more of a genius filmmaker, you know?
Yeah.
That it's like he's consistently learning, kind of like modern day. You'd compare him to like a Christopher Nolan or something, where he goes from his first film, like The Following, and you've got Memento, and then you've got Inception. But he's using so many of those techniques that he learned in those original films in a much bigger budget way.
Oh, that's an excellent example. Yeah, when you said that, I was trying to think who's a modern example of that. But Christopher Nolan's probably the best, if not one of the best examples of that. Yeah, definitely. So what did you think of the end of this movie? And before you answer that, just for the audience, so as I said, Alicia has moved in with Alexander and his mother. She's been trying to figure out the Nazi plot. Devlin, the Cary Grant character, has been checking in with her. Their romance is strained because, of course, Alicia is now engaged to and sleeping with Alexander, and they have a sort of a love affair going on, although it's largely faked. Cary Grant's kind of punishing Alicia for doing a good job, so it's painful to watch a little bit. And Alicia is trying really hard to be a good spy. As a result, she gets caught, and instead of deciding to, kill her right away, the Nazi mother decides that they will slowly poison her and make it look like she just got ill and died. So now Alicia is being poisoned. Cary Grant has distanced himself from her, and she's in a lot of danger. Now that she's almost dying, she's been poisoned, I guess, for a while. Cary Grant's Devlin comes charging back, right? She doesn't show up for a meeting. So he gives her a few days and then drives out to the mansion and tries to rescue her. How that goes down, I think, is better executed than it would be in a modern film. And if you consider that the end, like Devlin's strategy for rescuing Alicia and that very tense walk down the stairs, that's something that if this interests you, go watch it. I'm not going to spoil that. Maybe my co-host will. I don't know if Netflix wants him to do that or not, but I'm not going to spoil that. What I do want to talk about, though, is what you thought of the end and if it felt like an end to you. So any reactions to that?
I think it did feel like an end overall. I don't want to spoil it because now I'm under a lot of pressure not to say anything.
I think we're going to have to... I think we're going to have to spoil it, but maybe not describe it in such detail that it deprives people of an opportunity.
Look, I'll say this. In a modern movie, I think the ending would have ended as a sabotage, like an explosion of some sort, someone dying, right. A shootout, something along those lines.
Right. Oh, yeah.
But the way that it ended, I think, was very classy. And still leaves a lot to the imagination in terms of what's going to happen to the characters at the end.
Right.
Which I think is very unique for Hollywood, especially when people want these concrete endings. So what happened to the bad guy? What happened to the couple? And the way he ended it more, I wouldn't say completely open-ended, but just stopping before the actual end of the story would typically be, I thought was very well done. I was actually surprised that I liked that and I could see where he was going,
Yeah. So I'm going to spoil it now. So feel free to just jump ahead or skip this or be done with our episode and go watch the movie. So you've been warned. Okay. So at the very end of the film, Devlin has gotten Alicia, who's poisoned and dying, into the car to drive away. And Alexander and the other Nazis are kind of left to their fate. The other Nazis figure out that Alexander has gotten engaged with a spy, an American spy. So presumably they're going to be upset about that. And they've already killed someone for screwing up before. So then the movie ends. So the implication is, and I think this is the more clear implication, that Alexander will be murdered by those Nazis. Another fairly clear implication is Devlin has gotten enough evidence, or I guess Alicia and Devlin have gotten enough evidence that the Americans can stop the Nazi plot, right? How they do that, we don't know. All we know is now the U.S. government knows their plot to get this uranium and so on. So presumably they stop that. I'm okay with that so far. Here's my question for you. Do you think Alicia died?
It's a really good question. If I were going to look at it in terms of that time period, I would say no, because she's the leading lady of the movie. And no one would want to see that.
Right. And he rescued
her.
Yeah.
So I think the implications that he rescued her, she just got to the point where she was sleepy because she had told him, they're giving me sleeping medicine. So it was just a matter of her sleeping it off and not drinking that coffee anymore, and she'd be okay. That's what I got out of it. You?
Okay. Yeah, so I thought she died.
Really?
And Hitchcock just didn't think it was he didn't think he could sell that ending at the time. That was the impression I got, is that this was as close as he could get to the ending that he intended, which is Devlin was too late. He was too harsh with her. He was too slow to acknowledge his own feelings. He just couldn't be vulnerable. He couldn't commit. And as a result, she died.
Interesting.
And it's a commentary on being careless with your feelings, with other people's feelings, with not acknowledging how you feel. Like, I didn't feel really strongly, like I didn't think that was definitive, but my initial reaction at the end of the movie was, well, did she live or die? And then I thought about the movie and I was like, no, it's more appropriate. It's more fitting to the film if she dies on the way to the hospital.
I think
and then he has to live with that.
I think your interpretation is better, but I guess the consensus, at least online, is that she didn't.
Yeah, I mean, oh no, I disagree with the internet.
No, what I'm trying to say is that I think
it's not like Brainiac. I mean, it's just a bunch of idiots.
No, but I'm not saying that they're right.
No offense to our
I'm
lovely
not saying
fans.
that they're right. I'm saying that that's what I guess the general audience took from that ending. But your ending makes more sense. It's more interesting. But I think for that time period, I think it would be a situation where it's like, there's no way that she would die at the end, and he ends up alone somewhere in Spain, brooding. I think an audience wouldn't be able to handle it.
No, I agree. And I don't even think it's a debate, because there's no definitive right or wrong. I think it's more of, usually when a filmmaker leaves the ending, certainly key important points, right? Like what happens to our main characters, when they leave that up in the air, it's very unsatisfying. In this case, I think it's interesting. And it is very, very rare in my life to have a film that says, hey, this is the important thing in the film. And then at the end, it's not really definitive. And I walk away going, oh, that's interesting. It's just not me. But for this one, I was like, ooh, there's different ways to look at this. And I like that.
Have you watched a lot of French cinema? Because they're really famous for doing just that. The cut to black right before something really important is supposed to happen, which I find very, very unsatisfying. Like, I could love the entire movie, and then the ending. I remember watching a movie years ago, and it was something about you didn't really know if the main character was suicidal or not. And I remember the ending of the movie was just her sitting on a window ledge, just looking out the window. Like, she was just there, and it just cut to black. And there's so many other examples of that. But they seem to really like to make movies that are like, you're the observer in reality, and reality doesn't have this, beginning, middle, and really closed loop ending. But yeah, that's why it's so interesting that this movie ends the way it does, especially that it was a mainstream Hollywood movie.
And did you like that?
I found it interesting, just like you did.
It's interesting. Yeah.
When I first saw it, and I hadn't really thought about it, I just saw it and I was like, okay, that's an ending. I was actually filling in the gaps in my head, but I was like, oh, I didn't really see that, right? Which I found very interesting.
Yeah,
like I'm filling in the gaps
naturally,
and that's a great sign for a movie, right? That the audience member is kind of filling in what should be happening after the point where the movie ends, and not just feeling like they, were completely tricked or duped by the filmmaker. Right.
I mean, the simplest explanation is showing her recovering in the hospital and them kissing for 2.95 seconds again.
Which you've seen so many times.
And then moving, and then moving somewhere else or whatever. It's boring. It's anticlimactic, right? Like, it's not the height of the film, and you don't really need it. And that's why he didn't show it, right? That's the simplest explanation. But maybe it's maybe it's just because of the day and age, or maybe it's my personality.
It's your personality.
In my opinion, you can't. Thank you. Or lack thereof, right? I just don't believe that you can treat people that way, and that you can handle your own emotions that way in a relationship without there being dire consequences. So to me, a more tragic end is more fitting. But then I'm, a bitter old man or whatever. So.
In spite of that,
I like to see happy young couples in their 30s and 40s.
Get off my lawn.
That's right.
No,
Stop necking.
I see what you're saying, but you're right. I think the typical, but maybe for the time it wouldn't be so typical to have the type of ending where he's at the hospital with her, with the silly little one-liner like, "Kid, you're gonna get better. Don't worry. You'll come see me in Spain." And she's like, "Oh, but only if you stay there or something, And then it ends or something. That's what I would imagine it would have ended like that.
Right. And he's like, "Your bags are already packed." And then
but you're going home. I'm going to Spain.
Start cooking dinner now. I'll be back.
You still have that chicken in the icebox.
You've got a month to learn to cook. She's like perfect housewife at the end.
You're so silly.
I can't wait to
then
have
it's
children.
Like 3 months later. She's in an apron.
She's pregnant.
He's smoking a cigarette in front of the TV, of course, or a pipe
with a giant newspaper and not even acknowledging her.
This is the real world, baby. And then it cuts.
So awful.
That would be your typical 50s ending, right?
Actually,
like your typical 50s movie ending.
But that does bring up an interesting point, which is it would be a total violation of her character for the end of this film to be she's no longer like a dramatic person, right? She's now like just the perfect wife or whatever. Like that would violate her character. Like the relationship these two characters would have going forward would be a mess, right? It would be all over the place. Yeah. I mean, a big chunk of this film is them playing relationship chicken with each other. And she ends up married to a Nazi.
He's completely emotionally immature. She's emotionally immature. They're not like...
He's over controlled. She's out of control. There's no way the two of them are totally changed by this experience such that they live happily ever after. And it's not full of drama and, complications.
But here's a question. Was the audience of the time supposed to think that he was just completely, fully in control and the mature one, and she was the one that was completely
appropriate,
and she was completely out of control in an inappropriate way?
She needed some parenting and a couple
when in fact he was a mess.
Yeah. I mean, they might have,
right?
He's a total mess, and she's as bad. I mean, they're both competent people, and they have strengths, which makes them a good match in a lot of ways. Unlike, by the way, some of the other movies that we've watched that are supposed to have these romantic dynamics, like was it Lost City with Sandra Bullock and that monkey, right? So this is a great argument against that kind of film and that kind of dynamic, right? Like these are two intelligent, capable people, and they're both flawed in ways that I guess explain why they fell in love so quickly, but certainly explain why they have so many problems once they get connected. None of that is fixed. So the happily ever after here is a swervy, drunken drive in the middle of the night on a road. That's a metaphor for the rest of their relationship, which is fine, right? This is a movie. It's supposed to be dramatic and interesting. So any kind of post-credit or post-climactic scene that showed the two of them acting like healthy adults would have been a total betrayal.
Did you see the post-credit scene?
Nice try.
Go back and watch it.
It had Tony Stark in it, right?
It was all the bloopers.
So no, that would have been terrible. So I guess, again, another reason why this film ends where it does. So she doesn't have to die, I guess, for it to fit the story. But there's a part of me that I don't know if I want to say I want that, but that it does seem more fitting.
Yeah, we'll have to see the part 2. Notorious 2.
Notorious. So how would you remake this film? What would you change? What would you keep if you were in charge of an update here?
Good question. I think if I was going to remake it in a more modern way, there would have to be a lot more tension in that plot, because the plot is so simplistic. This is like a shadowy organization. We don't really know how they all got together. We don't know much about they're almost like NPCs in a way. The other
Yeah, their background for sure. It's just 4 idiots or whatever, and a couple of them seem menacing for a grand total of 25 seconds, and that's it.
I would expand more on that, because I think that would be pretty interesting. I think in terms of their back and forth, in terms of their relationship, I'd probably cut down on all the weird hokey dialogue between them, you know? And and I think I would just put more tension into that uranium ore plot line, because I think that would really improve it in terms of the spy side of things. But of course, like their relationship, you'd probably have to rewrite it completely for it to make any sense. It's almost as if like she sees him instantly in love, he's instantly attracted to her.
Yeah, that was weird.
And
it's like, just because they're both attractive people, they were like, I guess we're going to fall in love.
And then she's kind of, I don't know, her being drunk is kind of like a really strange device. I think it's kind of a cop-out, you know? Like that's supposed to build so much of her character or lack of character that just seems kind of...
Yeah, so much of who she is explained as her having an alcohol problem, and I guess a sex problem, sort of.
So it's really, her character isn't really that well drawn. And I think you'd need to really kind of, I don't know, there's a lot of work I think you'd have to do with this movie if you were going to redo it with a modern sensibility. It's almost like you'd have to start from scratch. It wouldn't be the same movie. You'd have like a skeleton.
That's the real problem, right? Like, in some ways, the characters they have traits that are really pronounced and very immediately you get it. Like, you know, you meet the character, you're introduced to some of these traits that define them, and you get that, but they're not completely drawn as people, right? Like, there's a lot of mystery around Devlin, and Alicia's history isn't really explored, and Alexander isn't really explained beyond, you know, the fact that he's rich and successful and apparently lonely, and he's a bit weak, you know, he's looking for a stronger woman, and that's it, right? And I think that it kind of works it certainly works on a level, but in a modern film, I'm afraid that they would take the Alicia character and turn her into a cliche, like him too empowered, which would ruin the dynamic, and the danger that she's ultimately in wouldn't really make sense. And Devlin's role as her almost like torturer and her savior wouldn't make sense either if you empower the Alicia character too much. But I don't know that modern audiences would tolerate a main female character being treated that way and portrayed that way. So I don't know. I mean, I asked you how you would remake this film, but the correct answer is no one should remake a movie that's, you know, well received the first time, right? You should find movies. You should only remake movies that could have been good, but didn't quite get there, right? So I think it's a bit of a trap to try to remake this movie. But it's also a really interesting challenge. Can you find elements that could still work now, and how do you present them without alienating the entire audience or big chunks of it, right? It's very, very delicate work.
Yeah, and you have to change so much of it that at the end, is it even a remake? Or is it just like, you know, when you take, let's say, Homer's Odyssey and you turn it into an action film because there's elements of the Odyssey that you really enjoy. It's not.
Yeah. And it's set in an elementary school or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think this would be a big challenge. You need to leave well enough alone sometimes, I think, and say, okay, this is a movie that's of its time, and look at it that way, as opposed to going the remake route. I think the remake really only I think it really only works well if you're in that general time period when the original was made. Because so many things happen. So there's so many societal shifts that happen between 1940s America and 2023 America, you know? It's so monumentally different in so many ways that I think you'd need to just, you know, scrap it. If you like the element about the uranium ore and the idea of there being a Nazi spy ring, you keep it. You keep the idea of someone getting recruited, which is almost like the Jason Bourne series. You kind of combine those two, but you've got a totally different movie. It's not film noir anymore. All right?
No, not so much. So it just needs a Jason Bourne character.
It'll be fine.
Well, so I would say, yes, I agree with that. And I would add that if we went through films released in that time period or around then, and we found films that weren't as well received, I'll bet that we could remake some of those to great success these days. Because they were, in a way, near misses, or they had good aspects, right? They had pieces of the skeleton that were good. And if people aren't really going to be married to the story, or it isn't a intricate, functional organism as it is, it's a lot easier to grab chunks and then add new pieces and Frankenstein a better film out of it. I think you can do that. But in this case, it's hard to imagine doing that because the pieces fit together in such a machined perfection way, you know, that if you pull out the wrong gear, then the whole thing just doesn't work.
Exactly.
So I agree with you, but I do think that you can take films from this period and you could remake them and make them better, at least the ones that didn't really work initially. I think that's possible. Right.
I'm just so unfamiliar with the films that didn't work because I'm only familiar with the classics, you know, and that's what everyone focuses on.
Yeah.
But obviously so many films were made during this period. And maybe if you went and rewatched them now, they would be amazing. Or there would be a certain chunk of them.
Right. Or aspects of it. Right. Where you'd be like, oh, I really like what they did here. And I think this dynamic is interesting. And, you know, this theme you could really play up and it would really resonate with audiences today. So what if we take another look at this one and, you know, remake it, but make some major changes? I do think that is much easier and more likely to succeed. I know typically success is defined by box office and the name recognition of a film like this one that's been popular for so many decades with so many generations. And the name Alfred Hitchcock and things like that will sell more tickets and also result in harsher judgments, but make more money nevertheless, even if it's not a good film, simply on name recognition, right? But you know, in terms of quality, producing a quality project, I would prefer to choose something that had really good ideas in it. There were good, like they're sort of buried nuggets, you know, it's a lot of dirt and worthless minerals, but there's some gold in there that you could pull out and build a different structure around and it would be beautiful. Right. So I think that's possible.
Yeah. Maybe a movie that was ahead of its time that wasn't really understood by that audience, you know, that just kind of fell to the wayside. I'm sure there's plenty of those from that time period because they were churning movies out constantly.
There's gold in Dim Dare Hills.
There is.
The Hollywood Hills. Anything else about this movie before we put it back to rest?
I think we're going to put it back to rest. It's a great talk.
Good. Any questions for the audience?
Do you think a movie like this would work well? Could this be an audio series would be my question. 'Cause I think it could be. And I think it would work well. Maybe even better than the movie.
The visual piece wouldn't be an obstacle. Right. You know, it's very easy to just sort of introduce those elements and describe them, and people's imaginations can fill in the rest. It's like for those of you who haven't seen it, there are quite a few scenes that are shot sitting on a park bench with a like city backdrop.
It's very much like a play.
That's not real hard.
It really,
it is very much like a play,
which would translate well, I think, to an audio series.
It's a really good point. Yeah. So I'd be curious if other people think that too. I'd like to hear people's thoughts on the ending. You know, I would imagine most people watched it and felt pretty confident that they knew what happened next. I'd like to hear people's thoughts on what preceded what I talked about, like the like Devlin's efforts to get Alicia out of the mansion and how that scene went down, because we're not explaining that, but it's very interesting. It's almost worth even just watching that scene alone. If you understand who the characters are and their relationships to each other, then watching how Devlin gets Alicia out of the mansion and how the other characters get pulled into that's real Hitchcock to me.
It was really well done. Really well done.
It was. And I think Tarantino has tried or has succeeded in his own way of making similar scenes. And they're more dramatic and longer and more modern. But Hitchcock, I think, I don't want to say it's where it started, but he certainly is one of the first to do it the best. And this scene is really good. So I would recommend people go back and watch that. I'd like to know what you thought of it. And then the very end, what you thought of that too. I think there are a lot of interpretations there. Very good. All right. So thank you to the people who made this project that we talked about today. Thank you to the listeners. Thanks for sticking around to the end. As always, stay away from those like and subscribe buttons unless you want us to keep doing this. You can reach the show at DontEncourage@gmail.com. You can flame us on YouTube. You can hit us up on Instagram or Twitter. Don't forget to check out the show notes for a link to the film, to information on Listoic's latest offerings, and personal appearances by my famous co-host here. We will see you next week with a brand new show. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everyone.